Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll head to one of the prettiest vacation spots in Europe, the Greek island of Crete. In May 1941, this key to the Eastern Mediterranean witnessed the biggest German airborne operation in history, one that had far-reaching consequences. Hi Jesse, here we are again, another week, another podcast. We're continuing our story with let's call it the Balkans, even though debate is Crete really part of the main Balkans or not. But I think that's it, because we looked at particularly the German invasion and, of course, the build-up to the German invasion in 1941 in that part of the world. And the story would be incomplete without looking at the fight for the invasion of Crete, which is arguably one of the perhaps most famous episodes, I would say, of World War II, particularly if you're an airborne spotter, because the German Fallschirmjäger do play a major role. And dear listeners, quite a few of you will probably know this already, that it's forever linked to the German Paras. If not, well, listen to the next 1, 2, 3, 10, 15. We'll see how many we'll have episodes of this particular podcast on Crete. I think before we really start zooming in and looking at what happens in 1941, I suggest we do what we always do. We zoom out and we look a little bit at context and the bigger questions surrounding this particular battle. Perhaps we should call it a campaign. Perhaps it's a bit more than a battle. But we look at all that in more detail later on. Say, Jesse, where do we start? The usual question, where do we start?
Well, let's get the ball rolling here. I think, Crete is one island in the Mediterranean, but the way that this operation plays out in May 1941, it's not for nothing that it's famous in the English-speaking world, let's say, especially in the British Commonwealth, and to some extent in Germany as well. There are a lot of different strands. There's a Maori strand, a New Zealander strand, there's a Royal Navy a story to be told here. There's a Royal Air Force story to not be told, I guess, but I don't want to give too much away. So let's start with the context, as good historians try to always do. Those of you listeners and viewers out there who've watched our previous couple of episodes, they're the context for this. That is to say, the Axis powers decide on a campaign in the Balkans in 1940 and 1941. Which leads up to its final phase, which is this successful attempt to take the island of Crete. Mussolini goes first. He decides to invade Greece in late 1940, October 1940. Doesn't tell Hitler about it because they're allies, but actually they don't get along that well at the same time. So Mussolini thinks he'll pull a fast one, show Hitler how cool he is. It doesn't go well. The Greeks stop the Italians. And the Germans then decide, well, we're going to have to finish this off because we want to invade the Soviet Union. So we'll take care of this Balkan problem in Greece that Mussolini has started. There's a road bump along the way, unfortunately, for Yugoslavia. So the Germans take Yugoslavia in spring 1941. Then they attack mainland Greece. The British land troops to help the Greeks to try to defend in the mountains. Doesn't work out. Everybody's thrown off of Greece. Where do they go? They go to the next big strategic place, which is Crete, big island in the Eastern Mediterranean. So what you have there are some Greek forces, some British forces, and they're a problem for the Germans. Do we want to talk about why they're a problem for the Germans? Or do you have more, Matthias, to add to that Balkan story in the lead up to the big operation for Crete?
No, I think that brings it all together, doesn't it? And dear listeners, if you want to have the ins and outs, the detail, of course, we had, I think, 3 episodes on all of this. So go back and listen to these. But I think as a scene setter, that basically it does the trick, doesn't it? Well, as you were talking, of course, my historian's head was going crazy and wild, because that's the part of the world where these things happen. And I was thinking back all the way to antiquity and Minoans and Mount Ida, say the birthplace of Zeus. If you're interested in Greek mythology, that of course also plays a role. But I think talking about that is taking it a bit far, probably, I guess. And we could talk about the Venetians who are there, the Ottomans. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that is fascinating, but probably doesn't belong. I just like thinking about this, talk about this, because I had a phase in my life where I wanted to become an archaeologist, actually, say in my younger days. And that's why I've always been fascinated by everything to do with antiquity. I then realized that sitting in an overheated office, library or archive is probably better than standing in a muddy field digging stuff up, which is quite ironic, because now in my army job, most of the time, or a great deal of the time, I now spend standing in muddy fields in France talking about First World War battles. So maybe I didn't quite get that one right, but there we are. But that's why I've got this thing about antiquity. But I know talking about this would take us a bit too far, so let's leave it at that. Otherwise, I get carried away.
I have you been to Crete, by the way?
I have, yes,
Matthias,
a number of
before?
times. So first time was on as we say in the intro sentence, a holiday. And then a number of military battlefield studies. So it's still one of these spots that is very famous, particularly with the British military, strange enough. So they like to go there and explore what happened there. And we'll get to that later on. You might say, of course, from their point of view, perhaps what went wrong, because I don't think I'm giving any secrets away when I say that in the end, well, the Allies lose this particular battle. So it's still a prominent spot. Probably the fact that it's not a muddy field somewhere in France helps as well, which gives a bit of an appeal as to why you want to go to Crete rather to, I don't know, spending November on the Somme or something like this.
I would imagine so. I went to Crete once on a combination military history tourism and holiday. So you can tell there was some negotiation with the missus about all of that. My main impression is that it was unbelievably hot. It was over 40 the entire time. But I was there in high summer. Anyway, enough of all this. We're now on to tangents about stories of my holidays, which nobody is interested in. Let's get to the question at hand here, which is, why is Crete important? Why do the British want to defend it? And why do the Germans want to spend precious resources in the run-up to Operation Barbarossa to attack it, right? And there are a few reasons for that. Crete is very well placed geographically. If you are interested in projecting your power, be it air, naval, or whatever, potential land power as well, in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean is quite important to the British, of course, because that's where Egypt is, that's where the Suez Canal is, so they're linked to India, and their ability to maintain the North African campaign from their bases in Egypt. So having Crete is pretty useful. For the British, it's not only defensive, though. They could base bombers in Crete, for example, and hit targets in German-occupied or German-friendly southeastern Europe. And the most important potential target there, as I'm sure any Romanian listeners or viewers will know, are the Romanian oil fields around a place called Ploiești, I think is how it's pronounced in Romanian. And that's a very, very vulnerable spot for Germany because Germany is short on oil. They depend on the Romanian oil fields for their plans of conquest, right? And if the British are able to threaten those, that's quite a potential fatal threat for the Germans, so they don't want the Brits to have, right? This is essentially, I suppose there's an outside chance that if the Brits stay on Crete, that they could, land somewhere in the Balkans later in the war. But I think it's the oil fields and its importance for naval operations in the Eastern Mediterranean and British logistics. That's really where Crete becomes important and why the Germans take the risks that they do to try to attack it. What have I left out, Matthias?
Well, I mean, it's all there, isn't it? As always. What can I add? But then
you say that every time.
I say it every time, and then I ramble for the next 5 minutes anyway, because, well, I think I kind of have to. Because we're supposed to be doing some speaking. I mean, it's all there. But you just look at the size of Crete, where it's located. You already mentioned it looks like it just looks like a huge aircraft carrier sitting there at the southern coast of the Aegean Sea. That's basically what it is. And this is, of course, exactly how the British originally see it. This is how the Germans see it. The Italians, of course, are involved in this as well, because the Italians, not on Crete, but a bit further to the east, the Dodecanese, they already have territory, if you want to call it colonies or whatever you want to call it, occupied territories. That goes all the way back to the early 20th century. So they're already engaged in this part of the world. And yes, it's mainly about the air, and you already explained this. It's interesting when you look at the directive that Hitler then signs in the end, which basically gives the order to prepare for the attack on Crete. Well, he says that Crete will be the operational base from which to carry on the air war in the Eastern Mediterranean in coordination with the situation in North Africa. That all in itself is interesting, because when you think about Hitler's ideas, Hitler's war plans, it's all about war in the East. North Africa to him is basically a sideshow of a sideshow. So Crete is a sideshow of a sideshow of a sideshow. So you can see really in a strategic thinking, it's not really that important, but once you get going, once you're there, a bit of mission creep sets in as well. You are engaged. You might as well just finish this. And I look at this and think, oh, this actually looks quite promising. So if you can seize this, you can protect the oil fields, as you already mentioned. You can also begin to threaten the Allied convoys, the Allied arteries that go through the Mediterranean. So it all kind of makes sense. And when you look at how the battle, and we'll do that in a minute, is then being fought and the consequences of that, it also shows a little bit that to Hitler, it perhaps wasn't the most important theater of war, because that's really all about the Eastern Front. But that's another thing, and I think we'll get there later on. But that is basically it. So it's a bit of mission creep setting in. It's flank protection, like the entire Balkans campaign. And of course, once now from a German point of view, you've managed to defeat all the Balkan countries, and you've also managed to kick the British off the mainland. And you've got a force there sitting on Crete, where it's reasonably close to the mainland. It's still a threat. They're in disarray. They had to leave behind most of their equipment when they evacuated. Well, now's the time to strike. I might also send out a relatively strong political signal. Think about the context again. Think about Battle of Britain. Think about Sea Lion. So this idea of the invasion of Britain in 1940, which of course didn't happen. So maybe if you're able to give the British a bloody nose now in Crete, well, first of all, from the German point of view, that generally speaking looks good, both from a military point of view, also from a political point of view. If you're really lucky, I mean, I don't think that was really part of the German thinking, but if you take all this a step further, you might perhaps even say, well, the British, from the German point of view of 1941, are going to begin to see sense now, because, well, even on Crete they're being defeated, so maybe there is a chance that in the end there might be some sort of peace negotiation. As I said, that's taking it one step further, not potentially really part of the German thinking, but you can see that the thought process that is there.
Yeah, and so if we put ourselves in the shoes of the Germans, as we sometimes do for the sake of historical understanding on this podcast, how are you going to get at Crete, right? You have some serious problems. How are you going to project some kind of force that's sustainable that can take the island? In theory, you have an ally in the Italians that has a great navy. And so certainly the German navy is not a major factor in the Mediterranean. That's the Italians' sort of part of the deal, right? But the Italian navy has suffered a couple of significant defeats against the British. There's this British attack on Taranto that takes out a bunch of Italian capital ships. They were defeated, I think, as well at Cape Matapan, for example. So the Italians are quite cautious. And the Germans basically don't trust that the Italian Navy is going to allow them to have a big amphibious landing on Crete, sort of Crete, I don't know, Normandy D-Day style. That's not really something that's going to work. It's not something that the Axis has the ability to do particularly well. What they do have is superiority in the air, because the British have almost no air power on Crete. And they don't have endless amounts of aircraft carriers that they're going to risk for Crete as well. So you're going to go with that, right? And now that's risky because it means that the German plan that comes together is a plan that puts the paratroopers and glider-borne troops as the main initial assault force. Now, before we get further into the plan and how the battle goes, Matthias, I think you're right. When off air, you suggested we take some time and we talk about paratroopers. What are they? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Why do the Germans have them? And all of that good stuff, because it's a very interesting branch of the armed forces. And it's a very new and sort of partly untested branch of the armed forces in 1941. So, Matthias, you're a resident expert on German paratroopers. Why don't you tell us a bit that we need to know to understand what happens on Crete?
Well, first of all, I have to say, when you say the expert on paratroopers, I still find this concept of jumping out of a perfectly fine, workable plane into enemy fire quite strange. So there we go. That's not really for me, but that's a completely different story. Perhaps you remember that I think one of the very, very early episodes that we did on this podcast, we were talking about the Waffen-SS and whether they were an elite force. And I remember going through some of the comments that our listeners left, and quite a few of them said, well, if you're talking about elite forces in the German military, well, you should talk about the Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, because they were the real elite. And again, there is a bit of a debate. Are they not? So the usual kind of thing. You need to, of course, look at the differences between the beginning of the war, the end of the war. But maybe suffice to say that when you look at 1941, I would probably say that the paratroopers are an elite force of the German Wehrmacht.
Yeah.
We need to be slightly careful, and I think I've said this before, because quite often I slip into the German habit of calling everything the army, because in the German sense, das Heer, die Armee, which translates as army, is basically means the military, because Germany as a continental land power, it's all land driven. Interesting enough, actually.
Boats are just wet tanks anyway,
exactly,
right?
And everything that flies in the air comes down anyway at some point. So, but in World War II, it's very different. So, for example, the Fallschirmjäger, which of course is the German word for paratroopers. So basically, the literal translation, Fallschirmjäger means para-hunter. And hunter is just the German word. So Jäger is, even today, is the term for light infantry. So that's where it comes from. That's the very literal translation of this. So in World War II, actually, the paratroopers, the German ones, belong to the Air Force. That's quite interesting because you've got an elite fighting force, which essentially fights on the ground once they've jumped out of these planes, but it still comes under the Air Force. The reason for that is that Hermann Göring, who was the head of the Air Force, said, everything that flies in the air belongs to me, which is quite interesting. So he says, no, these guys come to me, and that's why they basically have Air Force uniforms rather than Army uniforms. When you get to a later stage, if you jump ahead, of course, this whole concept of German paratroopers is completely taken ad absurdum. So basically, for example, you've got the paratrooper tank division Hermann Göring that fights mainly in Italy. If you just think about how to get a tank onto Ju-52 transport plane, that doesn't really work. So you can see this concept of paratroopers, of jumping out of planes, mainly as a consequence of Crete, and we'll look at that in more detail, basically dies after Crete and with the Germans, and they basically see the paratroopers as an elite formation. Where did they come from? You already mentioned it. This is a very, very a new cap badge, so a very, very new part of all armies. It is really developed in the interwar period. Leading on that to begin with are actually the Soviets. They're very, very good. Then you've got the Poles are doing quite a bit of thinking there as well, which means why you then have in World War II a lot of the British airborne force that are being forced are heavily influenced by the Polish thinking. So that's interesting. And again, off air, we were talking about this a little bit, and I know you've got something to say about the development of the Soviet paratroopers.
This is completely something that just stuck with me. I don't remember where I read it. I can't swear to you, dear listeners and viewers, keep this in mind. I can't swear that this is an ironclad source, but somewhere along the line, I read a very interesting, brief discussion about the development of paratroop forces and different ways of thinking about it, like you're mentioning, Matthias, in the interwar years, and that apparently the Soviets experimented with having paratroopers instead of, somehow they ended up at the idea that they would jump off the wings of the plane, which is completely ridiculous in hindsight. But I guess at the time you're trying to experiment with different ways of doing things. And I just have this image in my brain of a bunch of Red Army or Red Air Force paratroopers sliding off the wings of a moving plane. I guess I should have looked it up before the podcast, but this image lives in my head rent-free since I read that little snippet somewhere years ago. There you have it. I don't know.
But I mean, it points towards something really interesting, and you already mentioned it. So they're experimenting. It's a new service. You need to make sure that the training of the soldiers links up with the equipment. That also means, for example, the type of plane that you can use. And you find something similar even in the German military. Again, for a moment, I want to say army there. So in the case, the Air Force, because the Ju-52 that they use to jump out of, the good old Arndt Ju-52, as they call it in those days, that's a passenger plane. And it's not designed to be jumped out of them. So basically, it's completely ill-designed for what it's supposed to do. And when you look at what they need to do then, how the German paras have to jump out of this plane. So basically, unlike you would do today, where you just go to the edge and then you drop, they would actually have to jump out with arms up and head first so that you get away from the plane as quickly as possible. And that comes with all sorts of problems. For example, also because the doors are too small, because the parachutes themselves, the German ones, were not particularly great, the first designs, to be perfectly honest. That also meant, for example, that the German paratroopers couldn't carry any weapons. So the only weapons they had was normally the pistol. Everything else, rifles and machine guns, would be dropped in extra containers. So again, you can see there are all sorts of issues, and we will return to this when we talk about what happens on Crete. One of the main problems that the Germans find is simply do not have the firepower you need when you hit the ground. I mean, firepower is light anyway because you're a light force, but now it's even lighter, i.e. basically non-existent. So you can see this is all part of this trial and error experimenting. And it really only starts in the 1920s and basically really in the 1930s when the planes get a bit bigger, more reliable, and the whole idea of parachutes being developed. And as I said, it's the Soviets who are in the driving seat for quite some time. And there is a German delegation that sees a war game and maneuvers and exercise where the Soviets actually do drop people. Not quite sure if they just jump off from the wings. I don't know this. But the Germans then say, well, this is brilliant. We want this. And it's interesting when you look at the concept of what paratroopers can achieve and what paratroopers should be used for, that links in very nicely with both Soviet but also German military doctrine, where you take the fight to the enemy, you're on the offensive, you're trying to outthink, to outmaneuver the enemy, quick, decisive action. And that means you drop paratroopers somewhere in the enemy's rear where they can occupy strategic positions. So, for example, it might be a logistical hub, it might be, a bridge, whether it's a bridge too far or not, that's another question when you go to 1944. So things like this. But of course, the problem that you find is because they are light, they can't really sustain themselves for very long. They need to be relieved very, very quickly. That's the trade-off that you find, that you still, of course, find within these troops today. And that makes the whole thing very, very difficult. And once the Germans have seen this, and they think, you know what, that works really well, we can incorporate that into our thinking. So taking the war to the enemy, we talked about this in a different episode. We talked about blitzkrieg, this word that the Germans never really used, but the idea of confusing the enemy when you drop these guys in the enemy's rear. So that makes sense. And as a consequence of that, the Germans then also, particularly together with the Soviets, you might say, not together, but alongside the Soviets at the same time, build up this airborne force. And in the German case, again, very interesting. So first, it's the 7th Airborne Division, which then becomes the 1st Airborne Division. So they've got one of these divisions, and unlike most other services and branches and cap badges, so at that particular time, and it's formed all the way into the early stages of the Second World War, this is 100% a volunteer organization. You had to volunteer to become a paratrooper. So that immediately sets them apart. So again, linking it a little bit to this whole Waffen-SS thing that we talked about. So this idea that you're an elite.
Hey everybody, Jesse here. I just wanted to take a quick moment again for a thank you, for a community thank you, because of course, the community and supporters, that's what allows us to do what we do here on the podcast. So I want to give a shout out to one of our kernel supporters, and that is Steve, the man behind the Submarine History channel on YouTube. So thanks a lot, Steve, for giving us your support. We appreciate it, and it's thanks to you and other supporters that we can still do what we do. So thanks a lot.
And this is also interestingly summed up in the 10 commandments of the German paratroopers that were issued and that were given basically to everybody who joined the paratroopers. I normally don't give you long quotes, but maybe I just read it out here because it sets the scene quite well. It gives you a good feel for what the ethos was and the expectation amongst these people themselves as to what they could achieve. So it's 10 commandments. I'm just going to rattle through them. So the first one was, you are the chosen ones of the German military. I mean, that's the opening line. That already well makes you 2 feet taller than you probably already are. You shall seek combat and train yourselves to endure any matter of test. To you, battle shall be the fulfillment. So again, that's strongly worded, isn't it? That's not really necessarily what you find in a lot of armies, well, at that time or even today. Cultivate true comradeship, for by the aid of your comrades, you will conquer or die. I mean, that is interesting. And I talked about this in one of the episodes about this whole idea of comradeship and how the relationship between men and officers and all these things work. So that's a very good embodiment here. Beware of talking, be not corruptible. Men act while women chatter. There we go, that's the non-PC bit for you. Chatter may bring you to the grave. Be calm and prudent, strong and resolute. Valor and enthusiasm of an offensive spirit will cause you to prevail in the attack. The most precious thing in the presence of the foe is ammunition. He who shoots uselessly, merely to comfort himself, is a man of straw who merits not the title of Fallschirmjäger. So that's interesting as well, isn't it? So it's all about ammunition. Never surrender. To you, death or victory must be a point of honor. You can triumph only if your weapons are good. See it that you submit yourselves to this law, first thy weapon, then thyself. You must grasp the full purpose of every enterprise so that if your leader is skilled, you can fulfill it. So that's again this idea of mission command that you can really see basically coming to the fore here. Against an open foe, fight with chivalry, but to a guerrilla extend no quarter. That is something we'll probably return to when we look at the fighting itself, particularly once the Greeks get involved. So you can already see where's that coming from, because the German paratroopers do go around killing a number of people, and you can see this already kind of, you might say, inbred here as the ninth principle. And the last one is keep your eyes wide open, tune yourself to the utmost pitch, be nimble as a greyhound, tough as leather, hard as Krupp steel. You shall be the German warrior incarnate. I mean, this whole thing of greyhound, leather, and Krupp steel. This is a quote from Hitler. Hitler makes this. If you're interested, you can Google it. He used it a number of times. For example, there's a famous scene that's even on YouTube if you're interested, where he talks to the Hitler Youth and he says exactly the same thing. So, flink ist ein Windhund, zäh wie Leder, hart wie Kruppstahl. That's the German. And so he used that. And in the famous one, he said, this is what the German youth shall be like. So here they copy this, because probably most of these people volunteering would have been members of the Hitler Youth and would know exactly where this term comes from. So these are the 10 commands. I know it's been quite long, but I thought it might be quite useful just to look at this, because perhaps not only in this or the next episode, but in other episodes we might be talking a bit more about paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, and what have you. So I thought that was an interesting one. And of course, we're concentrating very much on the German paratroopers here, the Fallschirmjäger. There is stuff happening in other countries. Again, for example, look at Britain. Look at what we mentioned at the bridge too far, Arnhem. Look at Normandy, all these things. We're not going to go there in detail now and here, but particularly when you look, for example, at the British case, one of the reasons why there is a British airborne force is because of Crete. And the different lessons that the Germans learn compared to the British leads to different developments in all these different countries. That's probably enough, because otherwise we're turning it into an entire episode on merely the Fallschirmjäger and their concept. But there we are.
Yeah, it's a deep a historical mine for all sorts of interesting observations. I think those paratrooper commandments could, I mean, we could do a whole series of episodes analyzing them. What do they say about the Nazi regime, its ideology, its philosophy, its idea about war and violence for its own sake, and all that kind of stuff. But we'll let you fantasize about the analysis on your own, dear viewers and listeners, for today, because we are going to try to get to the island of Crete and some of what makes it such an important operation. Oh, on paratroopers, I should say that Canada had one parachute battalion as well, which saw all sorts of action then in Northwest Europe in 44-45. Why don't we get into a little bit of the planning for the operation? I think as we sort of slowly approach our vacation destination here for today, let me start with the British side. And Matthias, makes sense probably. You can give us the version on the German side. So what are the Brits trying to do, and what means do they have at their disposal? Matthias, you mentioned, of course, that some of the force available to the Brits on Crete is not in great shape. They're guys who were evacuated from the Greek mainland a couple of weeks, months before, which means that you don't have a lot of the heavy equipment that you'd normally have. So overall, the Brits have something like 30,000 British Empire troops. That includes some troops from Australia. That includes some troops from New Zealand. And the New Zealand contingent contains some Maori troops as well in a Maori battalion. So they do have about 30,000 men. That's not a small force. They also then have about 10,000 Greek troops fighting alongside them. They're also in a mixed state. Some of them are more militia-like. Some of them are more professional. But they all have this problem of not being an elite, let's say, more or less. However, the Brits have a lot of very difficult problems with their ability to defend. I should say they do have an advantage. Let me talk about the advantage first before we get to the problems. And that's intelligence. Intelligence is something it comes up in our meanderings and our tangents and our whatevers on this podcast. But it's really interesting at Crete. It's because you have this, the Brits have, of course, broken the German Enigma code with Polish assistance. So they know that there's going to be some sort of airborne and amphibious landing of some kind. That's pretty useful to know. If you are the British commander who's a New Zealander there, Bernard Freyberg, VC, we'll talk about him a little bit more in a second. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge, right? There are gaps in that intel. So they're going to come with an airborne and an amphibious assault. But where exactly is the focus going to be? Which of the potential 4 drop zones are you going to expect the main blow? For that, the intel is not as clear. So what you end up having is this New Zealand commander, Freyberg, he divides his troops essentially along the north coast of Crete, which is the one facing Greece, which is also the one where the larger towns are. And this is the critical point, where the airfields are. The airfields are the key to the whole thing, because it's not clear how the sea battle is going to go, but it's clear that if the Germans are able to take the airports, that they'll be able to ferry in more troops more safely than dropping them by parachute, which is a very risky thing, right? Because as you said, paratroopers not that well armed. So the key for the Germans is capturing those airfields. The key for the Germans, for the British, is to defend them. So Freyberg divides his force to protect these three main airfields. One of them is near the town of Heraklion. One of them is at a place called, forgive my Greek here because I'm not the best at Greek pronunciation, near Maleme. That is near the town. If any of you have been vacationing on Crete, you might have been to a town called Chania, which I think is sometimes pronounced Kania or Kanea in English, but I think it's Chania. And then there's another airfield near a place called Rethymnon, if I'm getting that even halfway right. So those are the focal points of the British defense. The problem is, among all the others I've mentioned, they're lacking heavy weapons, they're lacking artillery, they're lacking anti-aircraft guns. So even if you know there's going to be an aerial assault and you don't have enough anti-aircraft guns and ammunition, you're starting from a pretty difficult position. They have a few tanks, maybe like I've read different figures, 24, 26, 29. None of those is a lot. So you have 40,000 infantry and 24 tanks. It's not what most commanders would choose to have at their disposal in Freyberg's position. They also have virtually no aircraft based from the Royal Air Force based on the island. So in World War II, this is a huge issue. If this were all happening in 1915 and you had no aircraft on Crete, that's not a problem. You're going to defend the beaches. You can have static defenses. It's going to be fine. Probably. Look at Gallipoli. But that's not the case in 1941. You have no aircraft. You're going to have a serious problem. How can you compensate for that? Potentially is if you can move your troops very quickly. So then you can recognize where's the main German effort coming, or, oh, they've surprised us over here. Let's move them fast. But the Brits are going to have a hard time doing that because they don't have a lot of transport. They don't have a lot of trucks. And even if they did, those trucks could be destroyed by German air power. And they don't have enough radios. So they can't even communicate quickly with the defensive forces that are strung out on this island, which is quite a large island. I'm not sure how long is it. It's a couple 100 kilometers long, I think, or over 100 kilometers long. Matthias is furiously Googling length of Crete, I guess, behind the scenes. But it's big enough that you can't just have a battalion march here or there in a few hours. And it's also got some small mountains. So to sum that all up, the British have some good intel, but it's not perfect. They have a fairly sizable force, but it's under-equipped, it's not mobile, and it can't communicate very effectively. So this is sort of the lay of the land from the British side. Now, they also have the Royal Navy, but it doesn't have air cover either. So they divide the Royal Navy into several different forces, Force A, B, C, D. They're kind of around Crete in different important areas. And their goal is to basically prevent amphibious landings. The problem is you're going to be trying to do that without air cover. And that's a very, very dangerous proposition if you want to keep your feet dry.
Absolutely, and as you said, it's a difficult place because Crete is quite big, and of course I've got the numbers and the figures here. So east to west is roughly speaking 260 kilometers. So that's quite a bit north to south, depending on where you are, between 12 and 60 kilometers. So it is the fifth largest island in the Mediterranean. So it is pretty big. It's not a small one, which means it's not easy to defend. It's not easy to attack either, but particularly not easy to defend. When you need to decide where the point of main effort is, what is it that you're going to defend? Is it the airfields? Is it the coastal line? Because you're expecting a naval attack. And if so, where's that going to be? So you can see all sorts of issues, all sorts of problems. And other problems that you have, for example, is that some of these troops, of course, they're exhausted, they haven't got the equipment. Some of the equipment they still have is not really the right sort of equipment for a fight they're going to be facing now. You talked about the tanks. So one problem that a number of the British tanks have is that they only have armor-piercing rounds. So they do not have high explosive ones. And firing an armor-piercing one in a situation like the Battle for Crete is actually, I wouldn't say it's pointless, it doesn't achieve anything, but far less effective than having high explosives. Because they were supposed to be doing something completely different. They're supposed to be engaging German armor. Well, there isn't any German armor. Well, it's wrong. As far as I know, I think there are 2 German tanks that get landed on the island of Crete in the very last stage. That in itself is a fascinating story because there is a German tank commander. He realizes, well, armor would be a great thing to have. He just basically requisitions some sort of small, it's not even a ferry, it's some sort of transport barge has it towed by another ship, then realizes that he's getting too close to the British Navy or the Royal Navy. He then goes to a small island, hides, and then after some time, he then realizes to have another go at it and manages to land these two, I think they're Mark II tanks, if I'm not mistaken, so very, very lightly armored as well, on the island. And they do see a bit of action, but they're mainly used, because they arrived quite late, they're mainly used for rounding up Allied prisoners at that particular stage. But that's another side story that we have. But yeah, interesting one. So that's the issue that the Allies are facing on this particular island. So if we now swing around and have a look at what the Germans are doing, what are they thinking? Well, you talked about intelligence, and it's quite interesting, because very often we tend to overlook intelligence. As you say, sometimes you mention it in the margin. Well, intelligence tells you this, and yeah, it's very important. I say yes, it is very important, but no one really cares, because everyone just wants to focus in on what happens on the battlefield and the smoke and the explosions and in inverted commas, the cool stuff, because you think that's what war is all about. Intelligence is absolute key. Without intelligence, everything is far more difficult and complex. Same today, but it's also the same that even today, and also in World War II, intelligence, I wouldn't say it wasn't taken seriously. Once you get to a certain level, it's taken very seriously. But if you drop below that level, which normally is somewhere in the area of division or corps, intelligence is just something that happens. That's just being done. When you look at who the intelligence officers are, quite often they are not the number one officers. They're not going to become the 2, 3, 4-star generals. It's really interesting. And that seems to be the same in pretty much all militaries at the time. At a strategic level, very different. You mentioned Ultra, so that's very important. And then you look at what the Germans are doing. German intelligence is notoriously bad in both World Wars, also in World War II. So basically, whatever the Germans say in World War II, from intelligence point of view, is wrong. It's quite amazing, actually, how they managed to muddle through. And this also applies to Crete, because the first assessment, which is made by Canaris, so he's the head of the Abwehr, so the German military intelligence, he states that there are probably about 5,000 fighters on the island of Crete. You already given the numbers, so you think, okay, that's slightly different. They also assess that the Greeks will be neutral, or perhaps even, if you're really lucky, would join the fight on the German side, because they're very anti-British, they're very anti-oppression, they're very anti whatever. So a lot of wishful thinking going on. And you've given the numbers, and when you look at what happens later on, you can see, you kind of got that completely wrong, didn't you? So that didn't really quite work. But of course, this is one of the reasons why they then decide, say, you know what, we can have this airborne operation. It might actually work quite nicely, because they do have these issues. We already talked about the Navy. The Germans don't have a Navy in the Mediterranean. German Navy is very small anyway, so you can't really achieve anything against the Royal Navy. You've got the Italian Navy. You talked about the problems. So that rules more or less an amphibious landing out as the first wave. They still think that they need a bit of that support, and we'll return to that later on. The Italians are taken out of the equation anyway, because they say, well, maybe you can do something with the Navy. Maybe the Navy can still protect some of these convoys going forward. I'll talk about that later. But apart from that, there's not an awful lot the Italians can really do. There is a small contingent of Italian soldiers that land in the very, very last phase of the battle on the eastern shores of Crete. But it's not really something that the Germans take into consideration and, I would say, rely on Italian contribution. So that what does that leave? That leaves the air component. And so the advantage that the Germans have is, of course, and again you mentioned, is that they've got more or less control of the air. They bring down quite heavy Air Force contingents, and the British pick up on that as well. So the British intelligence, which is very, very good throughout the war, far, far better than what the Germans ever had, recognizes that quite early on, that the Germans are massing bombers and also other planes in Greece. And so they begin to think, something's coming our way. And in the end, the Germans have, roughly speaking, just under 300 bombers, I think. I think the official number given quite often is 280, about 150 Stuka, the dive bombers. And then, of course, you've got lots of the Ju-52, the transport planes, I think it's about 500 they're using at the time, plus about 80 gliders. So that's quite a heavy force. And they're going to rely on this. And that means they're going to use the paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, to seize the strategically important objectives on the island, which will then prepare the island for the second wave. And the second wave is then the one that's supposed to be coming in via sea, so some sort of convoys. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail because you can see how well, what's the right word? Shabbily that was done. And when you look at the fleet that they had assembled, basically fisher boats, that was it, and barges and nothing more. But that's the idea. Paris go in and open up the island, so to speak, for then to have the second wave, which will then continue in the mopping up operation. Now, how do you do this? There's a big debate in the German High Command, and there are two different, let's call them extremes, for example. So the one school of thought says, well, what we should be doing is we should be concentrating the entire force that we have on one of the airfields. Because as you already said, it's all about the airfields. The moment you seize an airfield, you can fly in reserves, you can fly in reinforcements, also because the Germans have control of the air. The most important of these airfields is, again, depends on the pronunciation. I'm going German now. Greek friends, please forgive me. Correct us and tell us what the right pronunciation is. I would say Maleme, which is probably completely wrong. That's the way the Germans do it. And I said that is the most important one because that's the biggest one. You hold and seize that one, then you basically have more or less cracked Crete, and then everything else is just subsequent operations. Then there's another school of thought that says, well, that's okay, but that means you need to have subsequent waves and different waves of Paras basically dropping onto the same position. That's not a good idea because what you want to have is surprise. That's the one thing that the Paras can use. It's the element of surprise. So you should have air landings all over the island, as many as possible simultaneously. Counter-argument to that is, well, that is also a good idea, but the problem then is you don't have a concentration of force. And you might just drop a few people here, a few people there, and then you might just get picked up by these, as they thought, 5,000 Allied soldiers. So in the end, they come up with some sort of compromise solution. Maleme is the main airfield, it's the main effort of the operation, but they're also going to be dropping slightly later onto the other airfields as well. So again, you can see quite often everything in life, including military decision-making, is a compromise solution. And that is the German plan. And they're giving themselves a couple of days to do this. They think because they think the Allied resistance is not going to be particularly heavy, they can probably seize that island within a couple of days. That is the idea in the original planning. And they're quite confident that it will all work. They think it's not going to be a walkover, but they think that's going to be really, really good. It's going to be manageable. Don't forget, this is an army or a military on a high. We are now in the spring of 1941, and look at what the German military has achieved up to that stage. I mean, that was, by the standard of the day, completely mind-boggling, unheard of, unseen. I mean, that is really an army that is, stands about 5 feet tall because they're full of pride of their military achievements, and there's nothing they think we can't achieve. As Gerd Fröbe says in the great film prior to the First War, the men in their flying machines, there's nothing a German officer can't do. That basically is kind of the feeling that you get there. And also, some people have argued, I'm not quite sure if that's true, but some people have argued, military historians as well, the Air Force, of course, where they don't really fit that mold that well. So the army, yes, absolutely victorious, brilliant, marched all over Europe, conquered everything that they can conquer. Air Force is slightly different. Some people have said they've got a slight chip on their shoulder at that particular stage, mainly because of the battle for Britain. So if you now use an Air Force contingent, and the paratroopers officially belong to the Air Force, to win this battle, that will also give them extra kudos. So that's an argument some people have made. I'm not quite sure if that's true, but I thought I'd just throw that out there as well. So that's the German plan. And you can see how these two plans are now, in theory, but then also, of course, in reality on the ground, going to clash.
No question about that. I think it's probably worth mentioning that one of the architects of the German plan is General Student, who is kind of one of the creators and founders of the whole Fallschirmjäger branch of the military as well. I feel the need to translate a little bit here between the imperial measurement system and the metric measurement system. Matthias, in passing, you mentioned this is an army that's 5 feet tall. But
5 meters, 5 feet is quite small. It's a midget, isn't it? Not a midget, but yeah, I got that wrong. That's true.
5 feet is about 150 centimeters. I think 10 feet tall.
That's probably better. No, you're absolutely right. I got that completely wrong. Yes,
going with that.
Yeah. Don't go Imperial.
So the Canadian, as usual,
I mean,
the bridge between the two systems. Anyhow, yes. So here we have the Brits and the dispositions with the strengths and weaknesses that we tried to point out. The Germans coming in with all these considerations that Matthias was pointing out. So in the end, the Germans decide to go for it. They named the operation Mercury. I guess they were as enthusiastic about Greek mythology and stuff as young Matthias was when he wanted to be an archaeologist.
I can just point out.
And so they marshal a force.
So when you talk about enthusiasm, I would just like to point out that I once gave a speech dressed in a toga in the Forum Romanum in Latin. If that isn't sad, I don't know what is, but there we go. Again, that's a different, very, very different story. I shouldn't have said that, shouldn't I? But there we are.
I'm sure the girls at that event were lining up to get your number afterwards.
Yeah.
In my experience, nothing like it. Anyhow, before we go fully off the rails and get taken off of YouTube again here, the German force that is assembled for this, before we sort of round up our introductory episode, I wanted to say a couple of words about that so that we fully set the scene. And in our next episode, we can then jump right into the action, pun intended, paratroopers, jump right into the action.
Ooh.
Hey. Yeah, I was also a great party guy to have at your party. Anyway, so the German force, they're going to use a combination of carrier aircraft, largely these Ju-52s that you mentioned, so converted passenger aircraft, and about 100 gliders in order to bring in other troops once they've captured those airfields, among other things. So they have something like about 10,000 paratroopers for this operation. Then they also have about 5,000 mountain troops ready to go. And those are the ones who are not dropping by parachute, but once the airfields are seized, they can just be landed like a normal operation. And then there is a plan to follow up with landings by sea, if all goes well with getting the Royal Navy out of there. And something like 7,000 troops can be landed by sea. So if you take that just by the numbers, you'd say, okay, well, they have just over 20,000 troops. If they think they're facing 5,000 or 6,000 Brits and a few thousand, maybe ambivalent Greeks, you should be good, right, for an attack. You've got your sort of 3-to-1 advantage. In fact, this force is probably insufficient, but the Germans don't know that yet. So that's more or less the forces that we're looking at for Crete. Those are more or less the battle plans. It all kicks off on May 20th, 1941, but we will cover that, folks, in our next episode. I want to thank you all for listening and or watching this episode. If you like what you hear on our podcast, Both Sides of the Wire, you can help us make it all come to life by supporting the podcast. You can do that at our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. That would allow you to become a member of our supporter community, and you can even get access to exclusive material that's not on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else you're listening or watching us. So we'd, of course, appreciate it if you decide to support the podcast. You can check out our War Room with its exclusive content for a free month trial by using the code DeepDarkWoods. So head over to bothsidesofthewire.com if you want to support us. That's it for today's episode. We'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. So, I'm officially recording.
We're officially recording. Da 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 da.
Sure.
Da 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 da. That's a different battle, isn't it?
Did you have a sweet lunch today? I don't know. It seems like you.
Must have been all the wine. I don't know. The Greek wine, yeah, just to get me started.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
No, thank you. Largest German airborne operation in history. One that had far-reaching consequences. I'll do that again because I went katuk.
I want to thank you for listening and watching What's happening? What is happening?